So the first one we have Riley Conklin and Annabelle Guptill, both use they, them pronouns. And the title of this speech is Don't Fool Yourself. Voting for Biden is not harm reduction. It's about to be good. Okay, I'm going to hand it off to them.
Okay. Hey, y'all. Oh, okay. Hey, y'all. This is Riley. I use they, them pronouns. I'm super excited that everyone is here on this call. I'm also very grateful for all these amazing speakers here today.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Annabelle, and I mostly use they pronouns. I am a white, petty bourgeois settler and farmer co-delivering this talk from occupied Tohono O'odham and Hohokam land in the Sonoran Desert. Our talk is called Don't Fool Yourself. Voting for Biden is not harm reduction. We'll start with the reason that we are where we are today because of the emotional, political, and physical labor of trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming, and cis Black women and femmes who have and continue to organize and fight for justice, not only in this country, but around the world. It was Black women who made the civil rights movement in the United States possible. While often mischaracterized as having a singular focus on voting equality and oft exploited to Democrats' unaccountable ends, the civil rights movement, in fact, as Pranav earlier elucidated, engaged in larger structural critiques of the United States government as an oppressive force. Our talk today is an invitation to critically engage with the institution of and devotion to voting in the United States. We push back specifically against what we'll call the white liberal harm reduction mindset, that we all must vote for Biden to beat Trump, a mindset that relies heavily on a voter apath binary, and from which emerges a moral imperative to vote and engage in electoral organizing and to proselytize others to vote. Now, this is not a view expressed expressly by white liberals, but the ideas contained therein do the work to protect largely white, petty bourgeois and bourgeois interests by upholding the state, capitalism, and white supremacy. The mindset relies on the notion that the US is a democracy, that voting is nonviolent, and that Democrats can be held accountable. Voting is a pacifier used to truncate critical thinking and engagement with our stakes in oppression and real accountability, as well as how much organizing can and does happen outside of the electoral system. Voting for Democrats absolves, falsely, the Democratic voter of their implication in systems of power, oppression, and capital. It is escapism.
This mindset encompasses many layers of harm that are disguised through a self-constructed obligatory role of electoral activism. A strong, unwavering belief in the governmental system drives the notion in which they believe it is a duty, in service of the greater good, to improve the system through active participation, which is interesting because they're able to recognize the injustices created by the government, yet at the same time choose to adopt a white savior complex to combat these problems instead of confronting actual realities of capitalism, white supremacy, and the carceral state. The white liberal harm reduction mindset fears those operating outside of the system. It villainizes those who challenge their coveted space that provides the opportunity for them to fulfill their moral obligations and economic power, and ignores the structural conditions that induce not voting in this country. By participating in and upholding liberal ideologies for so long, these folks construct an imagined obligation of praise for their activism and develop a cultural identity associating themselves as a good person, which in turn incentivizes other like-minded individuals to adopt this same white savior complex, therefore reproducing and expanding the same violence of the state.
Much belief in voting is grounded in the idea that the United States is a democracy. To our minds, there are three main material conditions that disprove this idea. The US was founded on settler colonialism, looted land, genocide, enslavement, looted labor, genocide, capitalism, looted labor, genocide, and imperialism, looted land, genocide. These are serious oppressive underpinnings of our everyday lives that have not been made right through large-scale reckoning nor state compensation. All of this violence is protected and made possible by the organized and increasingly militarized police state.
The system was never made for anyone besides white land-owning men. Since the inception of the country, the foundation of America and early legislation was systematically built to guarantee the wealthy would stay in power and dehumanize Black, Indigenous, and other people of color through manipulative rhetoric. This is seen in early policies like the Three-Fifths Compromise and a slew of deceptive treaties that stole land from tribes, all the way to immigration restrictions, redlining, Jim Crow laws, and a general denial of services. In a more modern context, there are still numerous barriers to entry regarding participation in the electoral system that negate the idea that everyone is free to be involved in civic engagement activities. Voter ID laws, limited voter restoration opportunities, reduced early voting times, gerrymandering, and other voter suppression tactics still provide the illusion of free engagement without actually allowing for meaningful participation. These strategies predominantly disenfranchise many Black, Indigenous, POC, and poor people due to historical systemic racism and barriers created from the previously listed policies, which in turn benefit wealthy white candidates and ensure they have long careers in power to uphold the system, creating their privilege. In particular, the electoral system has been constructed to provide an illusion of freedom that legitimizes the state and operates to serve the interests of capitalists, property owners, and those who wish to uphold a racial capitalism. Voting is one of the primary veils that manipulates people into believing the social contract, as laid out in the Constitution, is upheld. Voting makes it seem as if we have a choice in our future freedoms, when in reality, voting is the mechanism that gives consent to the state to exercise its monopoly over violence. Intentional non-participants are exceptionally subjected to this violence because they're the ones who are threatening the state's legitimacy, as they are no longer consenting to be governed.
Third, we have a two-party system here in the United States, two parties which, in the whole of the political spectrum, are really rather close to each other. Both parties champion capitalism. Both agree that the hierarchy we have as governance in this country is natural, legitimate, representative. The police protect Democrat and Republican interests alike. Both want to remain the only two parties, consistently ensuring the denial of third-party ballot access. Both remain committed to a single winner plurality, not a ranked style of voting. The two parties are overwhelmingly controlled by rich, white representatives catering to the emotional and material needs of rich, white, cis men, and increasingly rich, white, cis women. The Democratic Party continues to move rightward. While Democrats may purport to be liberal or progressive, their socially and fiscally conservative positions negate material change for Black, brown, and poor people. These elements do not a democracy make, and so we ask, if your freedom is predicated on the denial of others' freedom, is your freedom actually freedom? Trump is not the first Trump, and Trump will not be the last Trump, nor is he the worst president in history. Though Ronald Reagan, while perhaps more covert in his white supremacy, is the most recent iteration in the age of neoliberalism and a close parallel, there were 12 US presidents who owned enslaved people. The very fact of the US presidency champions the violent occupation of indigenous land and continuing genocide of indigenous people. Trump is a product of America. The institution of the presidency, structurally, is not and cannot be accountable to those without access to wealth, power, and whiteness. There is no accountability in this country without indigenous sovereignty and reparations for enslavement. These conditions will continue to produce more Trumps. Voting for a Democrat will not put an end to the police terror that results from the exploitation of Black labor and lives and results in Black deaths being filmed. Voting for and legitimizing this violent system is not nonviolent, and it will not bring about justice or abolition.
2018's blue wave took advantage of the tantrum white voters threw, losing an election they felt entitled to win. Being mildly inconvenienced by Trump played into their white savior complexes by tricking them into believing that their electoral activism for Democrats would help Black, Indigenous people of color in the long run, since their candidates were not like Trump. The Democratic Party relied on politics of inevitability and progress to justify their actions of indoctrinating everyone with a white liberal harm reduction mindset to convince voters a blue wave would fix the world's problem. But the vilification of opponents and platforms doesn't have an actual backbone beyond performative activism. This can be seen in the current presidential election, as Joe Biden is running entirely on not being Trump. But nonetheless, he is still a champion of the same policies. There has been no substantive claim about ways to end police terror for Black communities from Biden. This is because he does not care to end the violence, nor care to embody radical change, because doing so would force him to be accountable for his major role in the deaths and suffering of numerous Black folks due to his political actions, which in turn would spoil his shot at complete domination over the country and more money in his pocket. On a more local level, we see false progressiveness again with Mayor Romero, who was deified for being the first Latina mayor, despite her adamant refusal to support Prop 205. Because we are trained not to challenge political figures, we now have a mayor that jumps on every opportunity to engage in police control over marginalized lives and believes performative activism can erase her unwillingness to confront the police state in Tucson. Voting for Democrats is a step towards reform, not a step towards abolition, when they vehemently uphold and protect oppressive systems and capitalism. Advocating for and participating in the system to elect Democrats is not peaceful. It is violence. Democrats will not be held accountable to marginalized peoples, especially to marginalized peoples in the country, in this country and around the world. New Democrat Clinton built more border wall than anyone else. He created the disaster of welfare to work. He instituted NAFTA. Obama seriously expanded the possibilities of post-9/11 abuses of presidential power, especially in the areas of domestic and international surveillance, and waged an intensive war on whistleblowers. Voting for Biden will result in more of the same. Don't fool yourself. Throwing oneself into electoral organizing is a distraction liberals use to deny confronting their own racism and cultural and economic power. Voter turnout is prioritized above all else in money and labor for Democratic candidates, but accountability in money and labor allocated are not prioritized. This is violence. The emphasis is placed greatly on voting as an excuse to avoid confronting problems about the party and their candidates. Doing so would create barriers for them to retain their power within the party, government, and social structures. With no one to challenge incumbents and no real large-scale avenues to overcome the two-party system, the barriers of entry are too high to run for office, which in turn keeps the system preserved as is.
Some may think that abstaining from voting or voting third party are not legitimate ways to voice dissent, and that abstaining from voting is akin to committing violence against marginalized people. However, my friends, the whole matrix is violent, and continuing to center rich, white, cis men's material realities is violent, does violence. Maybe, in fact, it is less evil to abstain from a system that so actively kills Black trans women, to organize outside of it. A devotion to voting blue no matter who is a refusal to seriously contend with the structures both domestically and internationally that are at play here. A vote for Biden is a nonviolent way to kill people in this country and throughout the world over the next 4 years. If you have a desire to vote for Biden, really sit with it. Does that come from a desire to center Black, Indigenous, working class, disabled, gender variant people, and liberation for all? Or underneath the moral high horsiness that Democrats so nonchalantly and uncritically display, are you protecting your own material, racial, and status quo interests?
So what can we do beyond voting? Imagine, organize, and work for a different world. Join political organizations, study hard, vote for Howie Hawkins, vote third party, and stop insisting people must vote. We close with a quote from the communist, abolitionist, internationalist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, feminist, Black, queer, activist, pro-working class, revolutionary, intellectual, community builder, Angela Davis. You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time.
I can't stop smiling. That was fucking fire!